So that essentially is space construction, using kind of the simplest sort of form of kind of like a room that you'd have in a level, a small sort of room, and how sort of we articulate that space. But I did have a couple of more thoughts that I wanted to talk about. One, kind of like tying things that we're learning here to ideas from the previous lecture, and also a couple of other thoughts. So first off, wanted to talk about while we did talk in length about how to adjust sort of the definition and the integrity of the sense of a space. One thing that I also want you to consider as you sort of experiment with expressing shapes, with creating a sense of the space, is also like how it affects the flow of that space. How does it affect the player intentionality through it? So here we have a very strong sense of a volume here, but there's also a very strong directionality through here. The player enters one end and goes through the other end, and there's not really anything kind of slowing the player down in the middle. So this is a strong sort of positive influences on the side with the negative sort of flow through it. So this is a space designed for movement. So I want to get back to this idea of flow and how your spaces affect the player's intentionality. So if we were, for instance, to create some interference here, so this is ever so slightly sort of interfering with the pattern of the overall shape, in that we have this this object that's sort of like tilted a little bit to the side, and it's creating a dynamic sort of counterpoint to the overall rectangular shape of the space, but it's also creating a small amount of space positivity here in the center that would sort of encourage the player to slow down a little bit, maybe investigate this object, or at least to choose whether or not to go left or right or to climb over it. Let's go with a little bit more of an exploration to like how your outer boundaries sort of enclose and affect the player's pathway through here. So as you can see here, I understand that there's an opening on the far end, so this is not necessarily a space that that I have to come back the same way I came in, but I have very different values between these two entrances. This feels like a nice and easy entrance. This feels like a more sort of secret entrance. I think that that players might be more inclined to sort of move through this than through this this smaller space. It really depends on the player's emotional mindset, and that's kind of something we'll touch on a little bit more as we move into the course. But so this is a space, because there's not sort of a single enter and exit on opposing sides. There's going to be a little bit of lingering in the space before they find their way out. So here's another take on this sort of space, and here we have a strong sense of positivity as we come in here, and there's a bit more of a commitment for the player to hop over this versus to walk over here. So that creates a value difference between these two sides of this, but also imagine this is a window that allows us to see out but not move through, so that creates sort of a visibility of understanding what the space is behind us, and we have this door on this far end that is a much smaller sort of opening than out here, so the player may be a lot more inclined to sort of like move in the space and circulate through the space before heading out the other side, or possibly even they would come out here and come around the corner. So next thing I want to talk about is subdivision. So even though that this is an understandable sort of space on its own, it's important to sort of note that any space can also be subdivided into sort of child spaces. So in this case right here, we have a very strong sort of planar element here in the center that's kind of creating a perceptual sense that there is sort of two spaces in this overall space. Obviously, the strongest influence of what the space is these outer boundaries that is creating sort of this overall whole, but this line here in the middle is creating a lesser sense of there being a single space back here and then a second space over here. So that's subdivision. There's other ways that spaces can be subdivided, and this right here has a wall that's sort of poking out, and it doesn't necessarily divide this into left and right spaces out here, but closer to the wall, you definitely get that sense. Over here, we have this sort of three-dimensional sort of creating space. Maybe this is a counter for a shop, and it's creating this sort of volume back here. So we have sort of identity within the identity of an overall space. Even stronger with something like this. This very much seems like there's this is a space that sort of has a purpose of its own that's sort of special in comparison to the rest of this space. So obviously, this positive space created by the outer boundaries is something special compared to the negative space that's out here. So this is an enclosure, but even within this closure, this is somewhere where there may, who knows, there would be like a pedestal or something like that with a power up or something like that. It has purpose in addition to sort of the purpose of the overall space. The next concept I want to talk about is what I'd call implied space. So we're going to get to this a little bit later in the course, but essentially the idea of defining and creating the image of space without allowing the player to directly see it. So in this case right here, we have these two large planes that are sort of sandwiched and creating the sense of an overall volume. This is the same volume that we've been looking at for most of this course, but here we're not able to see sort of the back edge because we have this dividing wall right here that very clearly subdivides this section into a space here and possibly a space here on the other side. So we've got this doorway right here that's very strongly creating the sense that, you know, there is possibility in that space where there is sort of an opening. So this is very strongly implying that there is a space back here. And also the fact that, you know, just to look at sort of the horizon line here, the fact that this horizon line continues and we imagine that it sort of continues all the way to this side creates a very strong implication that there is a large sort of field behind this space, but we really can't guarantee that based on our point of view. But it sort of creates a point of contention with the player, a mystery behind here, that there is space that sort of we're implying with the shape, but we're not seeing it. And then finally looking at this wall here in the center, and as you can see, this wall, this length right here is much shorter than this length right here, and so we very clearly can understand how this wall is not aligned with this wall back here, which means there is space that we cannot see on the other side of this wall. And we hope that, or we could very well imagine that this is space that we could actually explore. And, you know, I think the door very clearly, like that combined with that, leads us to believe that there is a implied room back here. Much more so than, for instance, in this case right here, which we might as well believe that this is a full solid cube and that there's nothing behind it. But if we were to add some sort of supporting shapes here, we can create sort of the tree right here gives a sense that, okay, obviously the tree is going to extend downwards and be planted here on the other side. Most likely, at least, we've got this beam that sort of extends off here, and we can imagine continues here and in a space that has meaning on the other side. And we've got this shrub on one side and a small dirt pile here, and these shapes don't necessarily as strongly as the tree and the beam suggest that there's a space on the other side of this wall, but definitely there's a space on the other side of this overall volume. And here's another sort of interesting case where you know, these outer sort of lines are creating a very strong sense of a volume, and that's kind of what we're imagining here. And these openings here on the side lead us to believe that either it's going to be sort of an overhanging sort of like walkway on the outside of this, or maybe this is just a thin wall right here, and there's actually a full volume on the other side. So really, we don't really know, but the shapes here are sort of implying that one of those may be the case. A lot of times, implied spaces, in addition to you can sort of imply spaces not only just with the shapes at hand, but also with shapes that the player is obviously familiar with. So in a case like we've got a building here, essentially we understand that a building like this, people walk through doors like this. They open windows. There's a space. There's a downstairs right here, and there's a floor right here. Even though we can't see it, we understand this to be true simply because of our familiarity with buildings such as this, and it makes it even stronger. If we were to, for instance, open a window up to tell the player that this is actually an explorable space, because as you well know, in a lot of levels, you may have a building facade, but there may not actually be an explorable space behind it. So by opening up this space here, we create sort of, not only is there the possibility of a space, but we're very, very strongly implying that that space is an explorable space. So just to wrap up, when we are talking about sort of enclosure and the ideas that I would like you to sort of focus on, in addition to sort of definition and how well defined is the space, how well does the viewer able to understand the type of space that you are trying to articulate, but also the degree positive and negative that the viewer is understanding from the space that you've created, and how that affects the flow of the player's path. And then, of course, as we were just talking about implicity, how well is sort of space that you can't see defined? So despite occlusion, you understand space to exist based on the clues that are in place. And finally, thinking about just how subdivisions work and how do spaces within a space affect the whole, not only sort of like creating their own identity, but also articulating the overall volume of the space.